Hey, geography students. We have talked now about subsistence agriculture or growing just enough food for yourself to survive. And today we're going to talk about commercial agriculture. One where now, as places develop, they realize there is a market for those goods, and so they can make money off their products that they are growing now rather than just feeding their family. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so in the 1800s, a guy named von Tunen in Germany created a model to spatially understand where different types of crops and livestock and other types of goods are grown, or agricultural goods are grown, as it relates to the city. All right, and he came up with this model to geographically or spatially understand why they were located where they are. And so basically the rationale that he used is that at the center of all these cities in the 1800s, there is a market. And he's assuming certain things that we have to take into consideration at the time that doesn't necessarily apply today. So at that time, they had a problem with food spoilage, a lot more so than we have today with modern refrigeration and other methods. So the thing that he said would spoil the fastest would be dairy products, things like milk and cheese and butter and other goods like that, as well as certain fruits and vegetables. And so he realized that dairy farming should be located, and typically is located, close to the central market. All right. This also makes it easier to transport the goods because it's close by. Another thing people are in need of during the 1800s, before it was really industrialized, is firewood. All right, not only to heat their homes, but also to cook things and other uses such as that. So in that next ring, a very heavy thing to transport from place to place, especially without the use of automobiles and trains. Usually, we're talking about carts pulled by oxen or something else similar, maybe horse, is going to be your forest ring. All right, so this is where you get most of your firewood and things of that nature, because it's difficult to transport. So you want that relatively close as well. Now, on the next ring out, what we're going to see are typically grains, things that keep a little bit longer than dairy or fruits and vegetables. These grains can be stored for a longer period of time. It's a little bit easier to transport than your wood from the forest. So they're going to be in the next ring out. You also need more land for these different things as you move out from that city center. Notice, as you move out, there's there's more and more land available. These are bigger concentric rings that we're going into. So these grains need more space to grow. All right, and then finally on the very outmost or outer ring, we're going to see your livestock ranching. Okay, so things like cattle and sheep and goats and things like that. And the reason why it's out there, you may think, hey, that's really heavy too. It's way heavier than firewood. However, the problem with firewood that ranching doesn't have is that these livestock can actually transport themselves to market. All right, so basically they force them to walk down to the market, right, from these outer rings to the marketplace, to the slaughterhouse, and for distribution from there. And so in that sense, they didn't necessarily need to be close by to the central city. And also, think about it too, you need more land for grazing for these types of livestock products. So you can kind of see why that was set up the way that it was in the 1800s, pre-industrialization. And this is an important model, not just for back then, but it still applies today to lesser developed areas that have not industrialized. We can understand why lesser developed areas are still set up in a similar manner in many places around the world if we understand von Thunen's model. Now, things that have rendered this useless, as you see here, we don't have the same types of problems with the refrigeration. We have even refrigerated trucks, right? We have decreased transportation costs because we're not pulling things on horse and cart or ox and cart. All right, we have much faster means of transportation. It takes less time. It's less difficult to do so. It doesn't cost as much. And we have other methods of reduced perishability, things like chemical preservatives, canning, other means And again, the firewood's no longer needed. So this model does not necessarily apply anymore to the modern, more developed countries, but it still helps us to understand what the way things were like in history and also today in lesser developed areas. All right, moving on. So today we just talked about it. We have gone past the traditional way in which commercial agriculture worked, and we are moving into modern day commercial agriculture that relies much more heavily on machines. Not only those trucks, but things like tractors and other types of factories that process the foods, biotechnology, which we're going to get a lot more into. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides to be as efficient as possible because they're at the end of the day, commercial agriculture's goal is to make money. And so they want to produce as much as they can, as fast as they can, whether that's crops like corn or dairy products from cows or actual livestock themselves. And so what you typically see is no longer subsistence type of farming where you're growing food for your family, right? You're seeing the movement to growing as much food as possible to sell to either factories or to directly to consumers, which we'll talk more about later with some of these big agribusinesses. Okay. Here's some commercial farming, very different than how it would have looked in Von Tunen's time. All right, they would have been a much more pastoral area, not as condensed as you see modern day. This is a chicken farm here in these barns. And it really got its start, as we saw in just a minute ago, on the plantation. All right, when we started seeing crop specialization, which needed a lot of work, right, farm labor. We see that start, especially in the American South and the Caribbean, Brazil, those areas where slavery existed, as being the #1 place in which we saw commercial farming really take off, and it's because of this cheap labor. In that same way, machines have taken over the slave or cheap labor today and has continued to do so. All right, so what we see after industrialization on farms, these farm sizes are going to be huge now because we have these modern day machines and chemical fertilizers that allows us to make these farms as big as they are. We also see the number of workers needed decrease. Like we said, machines are going to replace the laborers. Think how fast this combine reaper can collect the grains as opposed to actual manpower. And we also see the number of farms decrease. You don't have as many competing farms anymore, and the individual farm sizes are going to grow. And so we all can trace these things, these trends back to the industrialization period, all right, where you see all these types of inventions in them, as well as the chemical fertilizers that we talked about in the Green Revolution. We have genetically modified plants that are as efficient and as productive as they possibly can be in the current day. And so it requires very little actual human labor anymore with the replacement of these different items. So less than 1% of all U.S. Workers work in agriculture anymore, or the primary sector. And so that shows you how industrialized countries, and this is true in many countries, not just the U.S. anymore, but very little people are needed on the farms anymore, all right, because of industrialization. And this leads to a food surplus. And this is why we see more developed countries that have industrialized boom in population because of food surpluses that can sustain a large amount of people. All right, this also allows urban areas to develop. Think about it. In an urban area, they're not really growing a lot of food. And so we have to depend on the rural areas to be more efficient, to produce not only enough food for themselves in the rural areas, but enough food to feed everybody that's going to be in those urban areas and be able to transport it there as well. And so our populations and urban area populations especially are going to boom after industrialization, thanks to things like commercial agriculture. All right, here's a quick graph to show you what that looks like. You can see here it starts in 1850. We have this here that shows us in millions of farms how many there were in the United States. And notice it starts off at a relative few, but think about the population in 1850 versus today as well. We see a huge jump in the number of farms needed, but as the number of machines, especially after World War II, take over and start replacing the need for human labor, we see the number of farms total decrease. We become much more efficient, especially after we see the use of fertilizers and chemicals and things like that to make us even more efficient than we were before. And now we can produce enough food with this number of farms for our entire huge population. So we have roughly the same number of farms in 2010 as we did in 1850 in the United States. And we're still feeding our entire population, and we even have food surpluses. We sell food to other countries, and it's less than 1% of our population. So that shows you how efficient commercial farming is. And the main players in commercial farming are what we call agribusinesses. These agribusinesses are ones in which they combine the actual business side of it, the manufacturing of food, with the farming of the food as well. So they own every step of the process from the farm to the marketplace where you're going to buy it. So that means that they own all the chicken farms, and then they hire people to work in those farms or contract it out. And then they also own the processing plants that take them to slaughter and convert them into those nice crispy chicken strips that we get to finally get packaged and transported to our marketplace and we get to buy. So companies like Tyson are a good example of what today agribusiness looks like. They own every step of the process. This is called vertical integration, if you're curious. But basically, they control it from the farm, right? They grow the chickens, they transport the chickens to the factories or to the slaughterhouses, and then to the processing plant where they're converted to those great little chicken strips. They're put into packages, they transport them, they own every step of that process, and then they take it to the market where they'll sell it in your grocery store. Tyson Chicken, like we said, is a good example. Also, Smithfield is known for their bacon and pork products. Well, they are also the #1 producer of pigs in the country. So it makes sense. If they own the pigs, they could process the pigs themselves. They can package the pigs themselves into the different things like this great bacon here that you'll see at the market. And if they own every step along the way of the process, it of course makes them more money. They don't have to pay other people to do those individual jobs. All right, they own those particular parts of their company. Okay? So this is what modern day commercial farming looks like. And we're seeing the number of businesses that actually control all the different things in your marketplace. If you go to the grocery store, the number of businesses that actually control them are very few. They have a bunch of different brand names, but if you look on the package carefully, it's usually something like ConAgra or some other type of company, Kraft. Companies like that own a lot of the actual products, but you don't see them as the label. So anyway, agribusiness is very efficient. We're going to talk about later some problems with agribusiness, and you've already seen some of that as well. But that's the way that modern day farming, especially in more developed countries, tends to look like, especially in the United States. All right, real quick, last thing. I want you to take a look at where these different types of things are located in the particular United States. On the left, we have where hogs are typically located, the number of hog farms or pig farms in the United States. And we notice there's some in South Carolina where we are, and a whole lot here in eastern North Carolina. Companies like Prestige and others that have a lot of hog farms in this area. We see some predominantly located, though, in the Midwest. Now, in the broiler or chicken production, that's more of the southeast region, and we see a lot more in South Carolina as well, North Carolina, a lot of poultry production as well as turkey production in the southeast, and you'll see these characterized by those large chicken farms that look like this, if you remember those. So those house things like chickens or turkeys and things like that. So if you see those driving around, it makes sense that it would be located in the South today.